The Civil War is without a doubt the deadliest conflict in American history. The most American lives have ever been lost during this war between the North and the South. The Civil War arguably tore apart our country. However, we were able to rebuild it after the war had ended. In this video, I'll be discussing with my friends Mr. J and Mr. P about what if the South had won the Civil War and how would the country and the war be different today. So, let's start this video now. One way in which the South could have easily won the Civil War would be if George McClellan had been elected president in the 1864 presidential election. George McClellan was a general who had a lot of promise. He was much younger than most of the generals. He also was a very able general. However, ultimately, he ended up being a huge disappointment. McClellan was a general who was overly cautious and just did not listen to orders from his superiors, which included President Lincoln, and he was ultimately a really arrogant guy who really talked a lot about his abilities but was just unable to follow through. He did not get along well with Abraham Lincoln, and they did not have a good relationship whatsoever, and this ultimately was one of the reasons as to what McClellan's downfall. McClellan also, the main reason why he got fired was his refusal to pursue Robert E. Lee after the Battle of Antietam. Lincoln was furious with McClellan for not doing so, believing that McClellan basically sold and ruined the North's chances of defeating Lee, so McClellan was fired after this. There also was a big political decision in doing so because of the fact that Lincoln did not fire McClellan earlier due to the fact that he didn't want to upset the Democrats, particularly war Democrats, who were supportive of McClellan given the fact that McClellan was a Democrat. However, after the midterms in 1862, Lincoln shortly afterwards fired McClellan. After the Civil War, McClellan did run for president in the 1864 election. However, he was defeated largely due to major Civil War victories by the North, such as in the Battle of Vicksburg, which was a key battle because it successfully split the South in two and ultimately led to the North winning the war. Not to mention the siege of Atlanta, which led to Atlanta being nearly burned to the ground by General William Tecumseh Sherman. These two major Union victories ultimately caused Lincoln's popularity to boost significantly and made McClellan lose in an electoral college landslide. However, McClellan would most likely have won the election had these two victories not happened. Had the siege of Vicksburg failed, and if Sherman's raid on Atlanta had also been unsuccessful, it's very likely that Lincoln would have been unseated by George McClellan. As president, George McClellan, he read his campaign basically stating that Lincoln was running the war in the wrong way, and he was going to run the war correctly. And this was despite the fact that McClellan did an awful job as general. He still believed that if he was president, he would run the war the correct way, and he still promised to continue the war, which put many peace Democrats at odds with him because they had wanted to end the war immediately. In fact, running mate George Pendleton wanted to end the Civil War immediately and create peace with the South. However, McClellan wanted to continue the war, and it's likely that he would have been supported by a Democratic House of Representatives, which in this case would have been flipped because in the 1864 elections, without these major victories, the House would undoubtedly be flipped and would be under Democratic control. However, the Senate, which was not popularly elected at the time, probably would have remained the same under Republican control. McClellan would not have been a competent president. He would have been unable to really handle the Civil War in the right way, and Lincoln would know this. So after losing re-election, he would try to win the presidency for his lame duck period. However, he would be unsuccessful in winning the Civil War during this period due to the fact that he would face political issues at home. Also, the Copperhead faction of the Democratic Party, also known as the Peace Democrats, they would be opposed to McClellan continuing the war, and due to pressure from the Peace Democrats, as well as the fact that Washington, D.C. would be in a serious threat from the South, it's extremely possible that McClellan would have agreed to peace with the Confederates. A peace treaty with the Confederates would have included giving the state of West Virginia back to the Confederacy and re-annexing it into the state of Virginia. Also, the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware would also be given referendums over whether or not they wanted to join the Confederacy. Maryland and Delaware would most likely join the Confederacy due to the fact that before the Civil War had even begun, they were in favor of secession during the 1860 presidential election. They both had gone for John C. Breckinridge, the candidate of the secessionist Southern Democrats, as well as the fact that the South would ultimately be given the southern portion of New Mexico Territory would be recognized as Confederate territory. This would be known as Confederate Arizona. Also, the colony of Liberia in Africa, which was meant to be a place for free slaves, would be given to the South, and that would be one of the South's slave colonies. It's also possible that the capital of Washington, D.C., would most likely be moved further up north, given the fact that it would be in between two Confederate states. The capital would most likely be moved to Philadelphia. George McClellan would be a widely unpopular president due to his inability to win the Civil War and his ultimate caving to the Confederacy. African Americans in the North would also probably be expelled and moved down south, with the exception of the two border states, which would be Missouri and Kentucky, where slavery would be recognized there, and the 13th Amendment would most likely never pass, and slavery would still exist in these two states. African Americans in the North would also be stripped of many rights and would basically be second-hit class citizens. The North would also be forced to return any fugitive slaves back to the South, and this would probably also cause many free African Americans to be moved down south, even though they were never slaves to begin with. The North's industry would be damaged immediately after the war due to the fact that its textiles were dependent on Southern cotton and the Southern agriculture, and without the South, their industry would be damaged for quite some period of time. The South would also be failing after its initial period due to the fact that they never really believed in states' rights. While the ordinary Southern farmer or crop holder may have believed in states' rights, the large planters and the Southern politicians certainly did not. This is shown by the fact that Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, actually tried to take power from numerous states during the Civil War and had actually argued for centralization. Also, the Confederate Constitution explicitly prohibited states from leaving the Confederacy, which was pretty ironic considering the fact that it was created by secession. This was during the war also that inflation in the South had skyrocketed, so after the war, it would most likely increase even more. During the Civil War, the South was only focused militarily, not economically, and Jefferson Davis was a weak president. He would most likely be unable to address this issue. The South would also not have any sort of roads or infrastructure, given the fact that in the South's Constitution, it was explicitly forbidden for federal money to be used towards internal improvements or for infrastructure. Therefore, the South would remain rural and undeveloped for at least 50 years or so, without having any really big cities besides New Orleans and Charleston. The South's efforts also to gain territory like Cuba and Mexico in order to expand slavery further south would most likely fail as well, given the fact that they did not possess a strong enough military. Sure, the South had great generals like Robert E. Lee, but after the Civil War's end, and after those men had retired from the Army, it's really likely that they would be unable to achieve their old military success. And the South's struggling economy would also prevent it from taking Spain from Cuba, and it would even stop them from getting Mexico. The South knew they would have to centralize in order to become powerful, so it's likely that they would become a slave empire, and would most likely end their democratic norms, and would become an oligarchy, where the planter elite held all of the power. The North's industry would take a toll following the Civil War, and the only way for them to regain their industrial might would be to put aside differences with the South and start trading with each other. Most likely up to 20 years after the Civil War, when hostilities would most likely be eased, the North and South would begin trade. Abolitionism, however, across the North and across Europe as well, would make it very difficult for the South to begin trade with these European countries due to the fact that they were heavily opposed to slavery. The South would probably have no choice but to abolish slavery eventually. This would probably take place around the 1900s or so. However, they would still institute black codes and numerous segregation and discrimination laws, which would still force African Americans to work as pretty much slaves in all but name to white landowners. Ultimately, though, neither the North or the South in this scenario around the 1900s would really hold much power over world politics, and they would most likely be roughly regional powers. The South would especially be less powerful than the North, given that its economy would be weak, but after abolishing slavery and gaining more trade access, their economy would most likely flourish, and they would gain the same level of economic stability as the North would have. However, their economy would be entirely dependent on trade, and especially trade with the North. So, now my friend Mr. P will discuss how World War I and global affairs would have played out.
Hello, I am Mr. P, and I will be talking about this. So World War One would change in many ways, as South might have won. The first major thing that would happen is Germany would have most likely won. This is because the American economy would be split between two different countries, and those countries probably wouldn't be able to support sending equipment and aid to other countries, and they had no other reason to. Germany would have most likely won because after beating the Russians on the Eastern Front and Civil War taking over, they had a lot of resources and manpower coming from those regions, and then they can move all their army into the Western Front, and that would lead for the French and the British armies for morale to lower down heavily, and they would eventually most likely lose, or it might eventually still into stalemate. But we probably think they would win.
My friend Mr. J will now discuss the impact of the economy.
Hi there,
Okay,
I'm Mr. J, and I'll be talking about this. As we all know, the northern economy was in dire straits at the time. That probably mean that they would be looking for as many ways to earn extra cash as they can. And one of those ways will be imposing tariffs on countries that they traded with. North was very industrially advanced, and they had many products that overseas countries in Europe would want. And because of that, a lot of countries want to trade with them, and that'll probably make them want to impose tariffs on all the countries that they traded with. And next, because of all the money that North is gaining from this trade with other countries, and also the other stuff that's going on internally, that'll probably lead to a situation comparable to the roaring 1920s that we all know today. And because of that, that would also lead to a small Great Depression. This recession wouldn't be as great as the depression that took place in 1929, but it would probably be comparably large. And because of Southern free trade, the South would have a bustling economy and trade goods made by slaves with other countries. And despite being so undeveloped, their economy would probably be on par or even stronger than the North's. Eventually, they would have to stop relying on slaves because of the abolitionist movement in Europe. But the overall system would remain the same, and the products that they trade would also remain the same. As the South appears to be pretty indifferent to change, I would also presume that this trade would help them forge alliances overseas that will help them in future conflicts as well.
Okay, and I'm back to talk about World War II. Well, like, kind of. So you might think World War II would not happen because World War I didn't happen. Then, Germany didn't lose World War I. Well, it's kind of difficult because France could have went into communism as they had a large population that were communists already, and the government that was originally there would lose credibility as they lost to Germany in World War I, and the communists might have taken over. They would also have a large hatred towards the Germans for them losing in World War I, and that might cause them to have similar feelings as Nazi Germany is against France. And they might eventually start a war against the Germans, which would in turn lead to probably another major conflict that could either be another world war, or either a regional war or a major war, something like a 7 Years' War.
Another notable change would be that roughly around the 1920s, there would be a lot of progress in America when it came towards society, particularly the North, not really the South. The North would probably around this time adopt women's suffrage, as well as give African Americans voting rights and civil rights during the 1920s. However, during the same time, also the North would impose restrictive immigration laws on other countries and would only allow immigrants from Western Europe in order to keep the country mostly white and Protestant. The Confederacy, on the other hand, would not accept the same social change as the North would, and would keep on segregating and would probably stop immigration from any country except for possibly white Northerners. The civil rights movement would probably take place in the South roughly around World War II or a little bit after that. And with the civil rights movement in the South, the African American population in some southern states may actually exceeded the white population, such as in states like South Carolina and Mississippi. However, due to the fact that the white Southerners controlled the government and also had several militia groups and hate organizations that would have done anything to stop African Americans from gaining rights, it's probably the African American civil rights movement would undoubtedly fail in the South, and white Southerners would continue holding power. However, around the same time, Southerners would probably face opposition from worldwide countries, similar to how South Africa did during apartheid. They would probably, most likely, trade with the South would have gotten boycotted, as numerous countries would have opposed their policy of segregation, so the South would have had to adopt some sort of modest civil rights bill. Given the fact that their economy would have been severely struggling, they would have no choice but to cave to worldwide pressure. This bill would most likely include an anti-lynching bill that would basically make lynching a crime in the South against African Americans. They would also probably give African Americans equal facilities to white Americans. However, at the same time, they would still keep the facilities segregated. They would try to make it on par with white facilities. At the same time, they would also probably try to put more money into rural development, because many African Americans lived in rural places around the 1930s to 1940s. They may also put more lenient labor laws and may actually help African Americans when it comes to the labor laws. They would put labor laws that would basically do stuff maybe like an 8-hour workday, or the same kind of labor laws that would have taken place in the North would have happened in the South, and it would mainly affect African Americans in a positive way. They could also introduce a minimum wage for African Americans. However, the civil rights movement would not cave until they would get the right to vote, so the South, probably in fact much later, like the 1990s or so, would have no choice but to accept giving African Americans voting rights. The right to vote, however, would be met with fierce opposition from white Southerners, so they would probably still put in place poll taxes and literacy tests, which would be placed with the sole purpose of preventing African Americans from gaining the right to vote. Even though they would still technically be given voting rights, these rights would only be rights in name only. They would also have all-white juries. They wouldn't integrate juries yet, and their all-white juries would still prevent African Americans from getting justice if they were lynched, or in the case that if they were wrongfully accused of a crime. African Americans would probably realize that it's hopeless to change the South, so many of them would in fact flee north, but however, most of them would still remain in the South due to the fact that their home was there for a long time. Ultimately, without the civil rights movement really gaining traction in the South, and due to the fact that the civil rights movement wouldn't really happen in the North due to the fact that the North would immediately integrate around the 1920s, civil rights movement really, its main impact, which was other than civil rights, was it really shifted America significantly towards the left, and the civil rights movement also caused America to pass the Hart-Celler Act, which basically allowed immigrants to come from other countries besides just Western Europe. However, in this case, the Hart-Celler Act would probably never pass, and America would still only take immigrants from Western Europe, and would still place restrictive immigration quotas. However, at the end of the day, America would eventually have to change this policy, so it would eventually allow immigrants from other countries. However, it would be far too late, and America's demographic would be much more white. Also, not to mention the fact that the South would completely ban immigration from any country other than probably the North, and possibly even Western Europe, but they wouldn't allow any sort of immigration whatsoever from a non-European or non-white country. Needless to say, the North's demographics would be 90% white, 3% black, and 7% other races like Asian, Latino, like 7% for other races. The South, on the other hand, would be 75% white and 25% black. Similar demographics to the Civil War. There wouldn't be any other races at the time. The only reason why the South would have such a high black population would be so that they could use the black population for work and labor.
There probably be many differences between the North and the South in present day, and some of them are economic. So first of all, the northern economy probably be very similar compared to how the economy in the current United States is right now, and it's focused very much on factories and the industry and stuff. So we probably see a lot of that. The northern economy, even though it might have not been that strong back then because of current peace movements like the UN and stuff, it'll probably be very strong as now basically every single country in the world wants to buy their stuff. So their economy will probably be very strong. And they'll also have a very strong presence diplomatically. I mean, now I feel like the southern economy probably struggling because first of all, the Southerners are kind of don't want to change how they earn money and stuff. So I feel like because they had a very agrarian and cotton based economy back then, they probably wouldn't be able to keep sustaining that sort of economy in the present day right now because slave and unpaid labor. So that's not really accepted right now in the current world. So I feel like they probably have to find a clearly new way of making money, and that'll be very hard for them right now because they probably only had a couple of years to do so. So I feel like they probably in decline. And militarily, I feel like the North will probably be a lot stronger than the South because their economic situation is better, and they probably have more population since they have more land, and they probably have a stronger navy and stuff overall since they started out with more and they focus on that more. The South, I feel like would also be very politically unstable because of many reasons, and the North would be also more politically stable because it's better off situation. The South, and as Mr. U.S. history said before, it was kind of like an oligarchy before, but that means that it's probably very unstable now. I thought a proper democracy is being set up before.
Anyway, thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel if you are new.